We are continuing in our trek through the book of Colossians, and we're trying to understand how we can really know Jesus, how we can become closer to Him, how we can figure out who He is and who He wants for us. Well, I think it's important that we understand that all of us are called to do more than keep a particular spot in the pew warm on Sunday morning. We're called to do a ministry. We're called to do something in response to God's love for us. Not because there's a rule that says we have to, but because when someone gives you a fabulous gift, you want to respond to that gift. And so this morning, Paul outlines 3 different basic types of ministry, and I'm convinced that every single person in this room is equipped to do at least one of those kinds of ministry. So let's look at the 3 types of ministry and see how we might find a way not only to minister, but in so doing, get to know Christ better. The first one that Paul talks about, he says, there is no other message, just this one. The first type of ministry is sharing the gospel. And I can hear you saying, oh no, Martha, he wants me to preach the gospel. The interesting thing about the gospel, in the meaning of the word in Greek, it literally means good news. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't turn on the TV nowadays without seeing all kinds of bad news. There's plenty of bad news around us in this world, and the most basic type of ministry is to share good news. Now, there's 3 different ways that Paul shows us that we can share the good news. Not everybody has to be a preacher, whether you're standing up front of the church or standing on the street corner. That's not the only way to share the good news. In fact, I would argue that's probably not the most effective. But Paul tells us that there are 3 kinds of sharing the gospel. The first one is sharing from your past alienation. He says, at one time you had your backs turned to God, thinking rebellious thoughts of Him, giving Him trouble every chance you got. I'm sure there's probably no one in here that has that kind of experience in their lives. We were once alienated from God. We were on the wrong team. We were doing the wrong stuff. We all had points in our lives where we went off the rails a little bit. And perhaps the most effective way to share the good news that you've encountered is to share a little bit of the bad news you encountered in life. Now, we all know somebody who's going through a tough time that's similar to a tough time we went through. Sometimes the most effective way that you can share good news with them is to let them know that you've been through the bad news they're going through right now. It doesn't take a theological degree to do that. You don't have to have memorized the entire book of Leviticus to be able to do that. All you have to do is to understand that God has turned you around and that you can identify, you can empathize with them in their tough time. That's an amazing way of sharing the gospel. In fact, I imagine that there are many people sitting in this room who first had the gospel shared with them from someone else's alienation. The second way that we can share the gospel is by sharing from our present reconciliation. Now, you may know someone who's going through a tough time, but you can't empathize with them. You might not even be able to sympathize with them. But there's one thing that you can share with them, that your life has been changed. You've been reconciled. The slate has been cleaned. The accounts are now in positive territory instead of negative territory. Look at what Paul says. Christ brought you over to God's side, whole and holy in His presence. Now, I know I've talked about this before, but it's so important, and I'm going to keep bashing it into your heads until you believe it. We, in God's eyes, are whole and holy. In the Gospel of John, when it refers to Jesus, the Greek phrase for Son of God is huios hotheon, Son of God. Now, the amazing thing is that in the first chapter of John, when John writes, whoever believes in him, he gave them the power to become the children of God. In the Greek, it uses the exact same words, huios hotheon. And I believe from the depths of my being that what John meant and what Paul means here is that when we have that experience of Christ in our lives, when we get saved, as the Baptists call it, that something amazing happens not just to us, but to our relationship with our Creator. At that point, when God looks at us, He doesn't see us anymore. What He sees in us is a reflection of Christ. And because of that, in God's eyes, we are whole and holy in His presence. At the Bible study the other night, I won't say who it was, but somebody came up to me afterwards. We were talking about how God had forgiven our sin and thrown it as far away as the east is from the west, not in a circle like the earth, but in a straight line, and remembers it no more. And this individual came up to me and said, I have a question. What happens in judgment when we stand before God and they open up that book? All the bad things that we ever did are written in there. God didn't forget them things. He wrote them down. And I said, here's the amazing thing about what Christ did for us. When Christ saved us, He took all that bad stuff in our book and erased it all. And when they open up our book as we're standing before the judgment seat, all that's going to be there is all the wonderful things that Christ did. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty awesome way to get judged in my mind. You see, in Christ's vision, in God's vision of you, you are whole and holy. You've been reconciled. And if you have the opportunity to be with someone who's hurting and going through a difficult time and can say to them, look, I've been messed up in the past, but I'm completely whole and holy in God's eyes, and you can be too, that's sharing the good news with them. The third way that we can share the gospel is sharing from our future glorification. Paul says you don't walk away from a gift like that. God has promised us that we'll have the opportunity to spend eternity in His presence. Now, I love Disney World. Disney World is fun. If you haven't been and been on the new Pandora ride, it's awesome. But Disney World has nothing on being in God's presence. Makes Disneyland look like a dump. But we have been glorified, and we'll get to spend eternity in God's presence, and it's going to be fabulous. If someone has lost hope in this life, and you have the opportunity to share with them your experience of what you're expecting for the future, that's good news for them. So you don't have to stand up front and preach to share the gospel. Sometimes it's as simple as sharing a little piece of your life with someone who's going through a difficult time. The second way to do ministry in its most basic of forms is to serve the lost. Paul says there's a lot of suffering in this world, the kind of suffering Christ takes on. Now, Hernando County, I understand, is one of the poorest counties in the state of Florida. And there are a lot of folks in this area who are on hard times. They're suffering. They're going through difficulty. They may not be lost spiritually, but they might be lost financially, and they might be lost in their living situation. You know, every Tuesday we hand out a lot of food through our food closet. And, every once in a while, someone will come in and they have this unique odor about them that only folks who smoke about 175 cigarettes a day have. And it's very easy to say, you know what? It's amazing how they have money for cigarettes, but they don't have any money for food. Sometimes being lost is simply being unable to make good decisions. And we need to not judge folks because their bad decisions have a little different smell than our bad decisions. Sometimes we just need to understand the human situation. We can serve the lost by understanding the human situation. We all make bad choices. We all do stupid things. For some of us, it's a bit more visible than for others. Sometimes our bad choices leave us hungry or homeless. And God did not give a single one of us the gift of judgment. But there are many of us who've been given the gift of caring and of compassion and of hospitality. And a way that we can minister is by serving the lost, by understanding the human situation. The second way that we can serve the lost is by understanding divine rectification. That's a $1.98 theological word down at the next Bible store. It means that we have been rectified. Our situation has been changed for the positive. We can help folks understand that their situation can be changed as well, that they might have the opportunity to make better decisions for their lives. But if we're just sitting in here warming the pew on Sunday, we're not doing ministry. The third way that Paul says that we can do ministry is by striving for the saints. We preach Christ, warning people not to add to the message. Now, if you remember, we talked a little bit about how Paul in this church in Colossus was dealing with the first heresy that we have in recorded history. It was the Gnostic heresy, spelled with a G-N, like the word gnosis in the Greek, which means knowledge. And these Gnostics thought that they were just a little bit smarter than everyone else, and that wisdom and intelligence was what we should be striving for. And in their striving for wisdom and intelligence and knowledge, they began to believe that the physical body was yucky. And it was this physical being that we were stuck in that was limiting us from all of this wisdom and knowledge. And that if Jesus had come to visit us in a human form, he certainly wouldn't have taken on this physical body because it's so yucky and God couldn't be present in all of that yuckiness. So the Gnostics believed that Jesus wasn't fully human. They believed that he was more of a spiritual vision that we had. Though we could see him and touch him, it was all just kind of a trick. But Paul is saying, no, that's wrong. It's important that we understand that Jesus came and lived as a human being in the flesh. He experienced all of the troubles and trials and feelings in life that we experience. That way, he knows all about us and is better able to forgive and help us. Well, Paul was saying that we need to not add all of these extra things to our faith. We need to focus on the basics. And Paul said that there are 3 things that we can focus on striving for the saints in ministry to help us move forward. The first, he said, is we need to focus on maturity. He says, we teach in a spirit of profound common sense so that we can bring each person to maturity. Part of the problem with church is that too many pastor types who stand in my position have tried to make things too complicated. They've tried to part of the reason they wanted to make it complicated is so that they would still have a job. If you figured it all out, you wouldn't need us anymore. But Paul says, we preach a spirit of profound common sense. This Christian stuff is not hard to figure out. Love God, love each other. What's so hard about that? And if we focus on common sense, it will help us to be mature in our faith. And being mature in our faith, we understand that there's more to this Christian stuff than just coming to church. What happens for Christianity is not what happens here. What happens in Christian ministry is what happens when you leave here. But if we're not mature, we won't understand that. And we need to help one another. That's a ministry that we can do here that moves from this building. The second thing that Paul says that we can help one another focus on is that we can focus on Christology. Another $2 theological word. That means to be Christ-centered or to know about Christ. Too many churches have too many classes on too many weird things. Meditating yoga. Understanding whatever. The first year I was here, there was an individual who said, how come we don't have a class on Islam? It would be important for us to know about Islam. And I said, I'll be happy to teach a class on Islam once we figure out the whole Christianity thing. There's so much that we don't know about our faith. And the basis of our faith is understanding who Christ is. We need to focus on Him. Paul says we preach Christ, no more, no less. If we as a church could spend 1/10 of our time working hard to understand who Christ is, we might be the most amazing church in the world. Because that's the focus of our faith. The third thing that Paul says that we can help one another focus on is that we can focus them on community. You're not in this alone. I want you woven into a tapestry of love, in touch with everything there is to know about God. We can't do this alone. We need one another. It's important that we spend time with one another. It's important that we get to know one another so that we can support one another. But it's not just community in this place. We need to focus on our community. I've said it before, I'll say it again. The church is the only major organization in the world that is focused almost entirely on the people who are not here yet. That's our job. Jesus didn't say, go ye therefore into every nation and hide in the corner and pray. He said, go ye therefore into every nation and make disciples. That's our job. Now that doesn't mean you have to be a Bible-thumping corner preacher. Sometimes all it means is to share a little bit of the good news. Sometimes it means to share a little bit of love to the lost. And sometimes it means being a cheerleader for those in your church so that they might learn how to go out in the community and share the gospel. This Christianity stuff is pretty basic. Don't need to go to school. Don't need to have a degree. Don't even need to know much about the Bible except the basics. Jesus loves you and He wants to be with you. I hope that you will find a ministry. Because when you're actually doing something, it makes you so much closer to your Creator. Because you begin to have a deeper and more connected relationship with Him. And that's how you'll really get to know Him. So I hope that you'll share the gospel, or that you'll serve the lost, or that you'll strive for the saints. Because when you do, you will truly know